Visual metaphor is anytime you're writing on the whiteboard, using a slideshow, anything where you are taking visuals to explain what is an idea that they should remember later on. Sometimes it's making the abstract concrete. That's really effective for visual metaphor. Sometimes it's taking a complex idea and simplifying it in a way so we can focus on one aspect of it. It's highlighting something. It also sometimes helps with note taking as well. I use lots of different types of visual metaphors, and they are really versatile in the classroom. You can do a lot of things with them. Most of my modeling is usually preceded by a visual metaphor that's going to explain here's why I'm doing this, and you can use this visual metaphor to understand what my big strategy is going on. And it's a really effective, it's a super effective thing. I will actually just improvise visual metaphors often. I just have my whiteboard near me, and if somebody asks a question, I'll oftentimes respond with a visualization that I think explains what I think is a complex idea. So we're using visual metaphors, as I said, basically when we have complex ideas or when we have abstract ideas. There are many times you can use them. Having abstract ideas that you want to talk about, talking about scholarship as conversation is actually really hard, like in front of the class, when you have nothing to refer to. It's so much easier to have a conversation when I can point to this and sort of talk about what's going on. Let's make a metaphor for scholarship as conversation. In this example that I have here, a visual metaphor, we have an instructor using nodes and pathways to say scholarship is structured like a conversation in the same way that networks or the internet are structured as a conversation or structured as a sort of interconnected network. What you're seeing over here is a student oftentimes emulates that, will write it down on their piece of paper and sort of write that kind of stuff, that stuff down, and it sort of works. So if you want to have a conversation or a discussion about what does scholarship as conversation mean, it sometimes is easier to have that discussion because what you'll end up finding is people will start pointing and saying, yeah, this is like a really well-cited paper that's used by a lot of people, and it helps them to make their point. It gives you a way to talk about what is a kind of an abstract idea in a way that everybody can understand, and it brings everybody on the same page. The other thing that visual metaphor is really great for are takeaways. So I'm using visual metaphors as takeaways very often because it helps us remember complex ideas and focus our attention on that thing. You can see that this person is drawing down. If you write anything on the board, oftentimes students will think that is important enough that they'll start to write it down themselves. And it's really great as a takeaway to take with them that, oh yeah, this is kind of how conversation works, and I can remember that for later on. But it's also really great for just them to write it down, to remember that, and going through that motion, it means they're following along with you. Visual metaphors make those complex ideas easier to remember later on. Google Mind Palace, or if you've seen Sherlock, you'll know what that means. Spatial things make it easier for us to remember. Our memory is very tied to how things are laid out spatially. And if you can make a visual metaphor that uses space in a way, it makes it easy to remember later on. So one, it enhances discussion because it gives you a tangible thing to talk about when you're trying to talk about abstract ideas. It also helps them outside of class to remember what we talked about because they have this visualization that they remember, oh yeah, this is kind of how this works. When integrating visual metaphors into your instruction, there are a few things you want to consider. One is oftentimes the construction of the metaphor is a huge part of that leads to understanding. So up here I have a metaphor that I sometimes use when I'm talking about how to research for understanding. That's kind of a difficult concept, and one of the things that is sort of commonly misunderstood by undergrads. Oftentimes they think they research for more information, but they don't consider that that information might be out of their own understanding, and that they need to work to get to that place to where they can make use of that information, or it makes sense to them. So I will often, and this is different stages of the developing metaphor, I will not give them just the entire metaphor together. I'll show them how it progresses so that they can see how it works, and then we can continue to add on it. This is almost like a little bit of a narrative that goes through, so I'm going to explain kind of how it works. I'll start with this round circle. I'll draw a round circle and a smaller circle inside of it, and I'll say this round circle is basically everything that is written on your topic. And this red circle, this red dotted line here, is sort of what you're prepared to understand, or sort of what you know already about your topic. So this is your current knowledge and then the body of knowledge that is already out there. So we're establishing some sort of some parameters for how to understand this metaphor. So we have that. Next, I'll say, let's say that there's an article that we find on a database that sort of sits outside of your body of knowledge, that if you were to read this, it would be very hard to make sense of, that it doesn't really fit within how you're thinking about those sort of things, and in some way it's not really super useful to you. If we were to research and try to find this thing, it might be too much and it might be overwhelming to you. You might try to use it but not really use it effectively or not really understand what it means. It doesn't really add any information to your research. So if that is the issue, we've now set up a problem. How do we solve that? Within our metaphor, I'll then go through and say, well, let's say I read an article that is sort of on the edge of my understanding, something that I do get, but it adds new information to how I understand things, and it expands my knowledge. That's this green arrow here. That we have the green dot and the green arrow, and we see that this green arrow is expanding our knowledge. So by the time we get to the fourth stage here, our red sort of area has expanded to include what is in that article. And now that that's there, we understand that we can now understand this article and it's adding more. And then we can continue the metaphor by saying this expands our knowledge to other articles that might also be here. And that helps students to sort of make sense as to why they want to research for understanding. And it's a thing that I think sticks with people, they remember. Even if they don't write this down, that works really well. But if I had just skipped to this part here and tried to explain all of it, it's too much information. The construction, the fact that we are building towards this, helps it to be more understandable. So I oftentimes don't have them, if you're going to do them in stages, like on a slideshow or something like that, have the different stages along that are making the different points that you need to make. The construction of the metaphor is really great, not just even that it's a visualization, but that you can see how it works and how it functions so that you can remember it later on. That's the huge part, that you see how that works going forward. So, the example that I chose, if you've watched the takeaways video, you'll recognize this pyramid. When we're doing complex research, maybe we're giving people a lot of databases to remember. I'll use a visual metaphor that helps them sort of structure their idea. In that way, you can see how I think it helps them in the takeaways video. You can see how I think that helps them outside of class to make more sense and make their research more effective when they're not in class. But we're going to talk about the construction of the metaphor and sort of how I think this works and how it helps them to diagnose their own issues and help them make sense of the situation that they're encountering. So I will present this triangle as a pyramid of different sources to use, but I'll also present it as a mountain that they are climbing. We're going to pretend that as this triangle narrows, or this mountain narrows, that there are less and less people talking about that are in the conversation at the top. These are the specialists. At the very top, you're going to find the specialists, the people who know the most, that are on the cutting edge of what is actually known. And we imagine that the people who know most about cancer research are those that have been studying it for a long time, and they're going to be up here. And oftentimes, they have their own dedicated resources. For medical information, that's going to be PubMed. So I'll write down PubMed, and I'll say, this is where we're trying to get to. Now, I would also say if you go to PubMed and start reading articles and you're not ready to be there and you don't understand what they're talking about, they're made to talk to each other. You have to work your way up from here to here. So oftentimes I'll draw a person on the side here and I say, this is you. Now diagnose where you think you are. If you get to PubMed and you start reading it and it doesn't make any sense to you, it means you maybe need to take another step down. And I'll give them another series of databases. Consumer health. It's still specialized information, but it is less, it's written at a level that's easier to understand than maybe PubMed is. If you're at consumer health and it's still not making any sense to you, then maybe we need to go to the CDC and the NIH. These are websites that are really geared towards public information. They're written at sometimes at a consumer level, sometimes they're written for doctors, but they have some really useful information and they can help you make sense of a lot of information very quickly and can help you go through. If that stuff's not even making sense to you, Medline Plus is the place to go. Now, Medline Plus is very basic information, almost like definitions, like a dictionary of medical terms. or diseases. That's a really great place to start. If you don't know anything, Medline Plus is the place to go. And you can see that the majority of people need more information, and it starts to get more and more specialized as you work your way up. Now, how does this work as a visual metaphor? Well, there's a few things that are going on here. One, it works as a diagnostic tool that they can sort of figure out where they need to be and what database they need to be using at any given time. They can start to use this to self-assess and be able to teach themselves after they get out of the class. The other part is it contains a lot of information. If you watch the takeaways, it contains a ton of databases in an easy to understand information. So it makes something very complex and with a lot of aspects to it very simple. It's just a triangle with four parts. It also provides a structure that they can use later on. I talk about in the takeaways videos that they can take this, strip everything out of it, insert their own, insert whatever discipline they're working with, and try to figure out where they fit within this, and they can use that later on. That visual metaphor does so much, and then when I start to talk with them about what database do you think you need to be using, what resource is going to work best for you, they have a way to talk about this. We can point to the triangle and say, I think I need to be using the CDC website because I know some basic information, but I have gone to the consumer health site and some of that stuff seems beyond my understanding. So I'm going to work to try to get to that place. And I think the CDC website works really well for me. Self-diagnostics is so great, like that, and the visual metaphor allows that to happen. Using visuals is really, really neat, and it allows you to talk about something that is kind of abstract, like diagnosing what database to use, in a very concrete way. And it takes some time, it takes some getting comfortable and getting used to. You might come up with a few visual metaphors that work really well for you, and those will be some of your go-tos, but I would ask you to try to expand and try to understand why they work, because understanding why they work can help you come up with even better metaphors that work even better. This, to me, started out as just a triangle, and then I realized that triangles are also kind of mountains, and the idea of climbing a mountain of information became really useful. Where I've gone from there is that if they're writing a science paper where they're having to write to a basic audience, it now allows me to expand the metaphor to say, you're trying to take this information and report it down to a level that you were at previously, at a level that the CDC and the NIH does, and it helps you to understand the writing part of that and why you're producing the knowledge in the first place. It's neat how the metaphors can expand and start to be things that help to explain and help people understand the context of what they're actually trying to do when they're doing research. I love visual metaphors, as you can see. I think that they are things that they're one of the most versatile tools, and if you're ever trying to explain something really difficult, it's great when the words are failing you to draw a picture and say, this is how it works, at least in my mind.